He was 19 years old and had killed 11 people in 8 days. His girlfriend was 14. Between January 21st and January 29th, 1958, Charles Starkweather and Carol fugate toward Nebraska and Wyoming, leaving a trail of bodies that would paralyze an entire state with fear. Schools closed, gun stores sold out, families locked their doors in broad daylight. And when it was over, America would never look at teenage rebellion the same way again. But what turns a bow-legged garbage man from Lincoln, Nebraska, into one of the most notorious spree killers in American history? What makes a 14-year-old girl follow him into the darkness? The victims range from a 2-year-old child to a 70-year-old farmer. Some were shot, others were stabbed. One was strangled with a belt. And through it all, Charles and Carol ate their victims' food, watched their televisions, and stole their clothes before moving on to the next target. By the time police cornered them on a Wyoming highway, the body count had reached double digits. The manhunt had stretched across state lines. And the question everyone was asking wasn't just how they did it, but why? Charles Starkweather would face the electric chair for his crimes. But before the switch was thrown, he would give interviews, write letters, and offer conflicting stories about what really happened during those 8 days of terror. He would become the inspiration for movies, songs, and countless debates about violence, youth, and the American dream gone wrong. This is a story of how it all unfolded and how it ended. June 25th, 1959, Nebraska State Penitentiary. Charles Starkweather ordered his last meal at dawn: cold cuts, sliced bread, a pot of black coffee. Nothing fancy, nothing memorable. For a man who had spent 17 months on death row, it was a strangely ordinary request. The death chamber waited in silence. The electric chair sat bolted to the floor, its leather straps hanging loose, its metal cap polished to a dull shine. In a few hours, 2,200 volts would course through the body of a 20-year-old man who would become America's most infamous teenage killer. Prison officials had tested the equipment twice. Everything was ready. Charles Raymond Starkweather stood 5 feet 5 inches tall. His red hair was neatly combed. His bow-legged walk had always made him easy to spot in a crowd. Now, in the final hours of his life, that distinctive gait would carry him from his cell to the chair where his life would end. He was calm. Some witnesses would later say he seemed almost eager. Outside the prison walls, 11 families waited for justice. Velda Bartlett, Marion Bartlett, Betty Jean Bartlett, just 2 years old. August Meyer, 70 years old. Robert Jensen, 17. Carol King, 16. C. Lauer Ward, Clara Ward, Lillian Fenkel, Merle Collison, Robert Culvert. Their names have been repeated in newspapers for 17 months. Their photographs had stared out from front pages across the nation. And now, finally, the man who had taken their lives would pay with his own. But even as the clock ticked toward midnight, the question remained, why did he do it? Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on January 24th, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska, the third of 7 children. His father was a carpenter. His mother took in laundry to help pay the bills. The family lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, where poverty wasn't just a condition but a way of life. From the beginning, Charles was different. He was born bow-legged, a condition that made him walk with a distinctive rolling gait that other children noticed immediately. He had a speech impediment that made him struggle with certain words. By the time he entered elementary school, the bullying had already started. The other kids called him names. They mocked his walk. They laughed at the way he talked. And Charles, small and powerless, learned to hate them for it. The rage started early. Teachers noted it in their reports. His parents saw it at home. When Charles got angry, something shifted in his eyes. His face would flush red. His fists would clench. And sometimes, that rage would explode into violence. He got into fights at school. He lashed out at his siblings. But mostly, he turned that anger inward, nursing like a flame that never quite went out. By the time he reached high school, Charles had found his hero, James Dean. He watched Rebel Without a Cause again and again, memorizing Dean's swagger, his defiance, his cool rejection of authority. Charles styled his red hair like Dean's. He wore jeans and a leather jacket. He practiced that same brooding stare in the mirror. If the world was going to mock him, he would become something they feared instead. But high school didn't last long. Charles dropped out in his junior year. He had no interest in books, no patience for teachers who looked at him like he was nothing. Instead, he took a job as a garbage man, hauling trash through the streets of Lincoln for $1 an hour. It was hard work. It was dirty work. And it reminded him every single day of exactly where he stood in the world's pecking order. Then, in 1956, when Charles was 18 years old, he met a girl named Carol Ann Fugate. She was 13. Carolyn was small, with dark hair and delicate features. She lived with her mother, Velda Bartlett, her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, and her baby half-sister, Betty Jean. The Fugates were working class like the Starkweathers, but Charles saw something in Carol and that he'd never seen in anyone else. She looked at him like he mattered. She listened when he talked. She laughed at his jokes. And for the first time in his life, Charles felt like somebody. Their relationship developed quickly, too quickly for Carol Ann's parents, who didn't approve of their daughter dating a high school dropout 5 years her senior. They set rules. They tried to limit the time Charles and Carol spent together. But rules meant nothing to Charles Starkweather. If the world was going to tell him no, he would find a way to say yes. By 1957, the cracks were beginning to show. Charles had violent outbursts. He talked about getting revenge on people who had wronged him. He carried a rifle in his car, claiming he needed it for hunting. His friends noticed the change. One of them would later tell police that Charles had become someone different, someone darker. On December 1st, 1957, Charles walked into a gas station on the outskirts of Lincoln. The attendant on duty was Robert Calvert, 21 years old. Charles pulled out a shotgun and demanded money. Calvert handed over the cash from the register. Then Charles made him drive to a remote area outside town. What happened next, only Charles knew for certain. But when police found Robert Calvert's body the next day, he had been shot in the head. The murder went unsolved for weeks. Charles told no one, not his family, not his friends, not even Carol Ann. He went back to work hauling garbage. He went back to visiting Carol and at her parents' house. He went back to being just another nobody in Lincoln, Nebraska. But inside, something had changed. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And soon, the whole world would know his name. January 21st, 1958, Charles Starkweather drove to the Bartlett house on Belmont Avenue. He arrived in the afternoon. Carolyn wasn't home. Her mother, Velda, and her stepfather, Marion, were there. So was 2-year-old Betty Jean. What exactly was said that day remains disputed. But what happened next is not. Charles shot Marion Bartlett in the head. He shot Velda Bartlett as she tried to run. And then, with the parents dead or dying, he turned to Betty Jean. The toddler was strangled. Some reports say it was with a belt. Others say it was by hand. Either way, the child died in that house while Charles waited for Carol Ann to come home. When Carolyn returned, she found Charles with a gun and her family dead. What happened in the following hours is one of the great mysteries of the case. Did Charles threaten her? Did she help him? Did she know what he'd done? The answers would change depending on who was telling the story. But this much is certain, Carolyn stayed. For 6 days, she and Charles remained in that house with 3 corpses hidden in a chicken coop and an outbuilding. They entertained visitors. They told people Carol Ann's family was sick with the flu. They posted a sign on the door, "Stay away, everybody is sick with the flu." And when Carol Ann's relatives came by asking questions, Charles turned them away at gunpoint. On January 27th, they ran. Charles drove him to the farm of August Meyer, 70 years old, a family friend who had known Charles since childhood. August was shot in the head with his own rifle. His body was left in the wash house. Charles and Carol Ann took food from the house. They took clothing. They took Meyer's weapons. Then they moved on. Later that same day, they encountered 2 teenagers on a rural road near Bennett, Nebraska. Robert Jensen, 17, was driving with his girlfriend, Carol King, 16. They were headed home from a date. Charles flagged him down, claiming his car was stuck. When Robert stopped to help, Charles pulled a gun. He forced the teenagers into an abandoned storm cellar at gunpoint. Robert Jensen was shot 6 times. Carol King was stabbed repeatedly. Her body showed signs of sexual assault. The 2 teenagers were left in the cellar. Their lives ended before they had barely begun. By nightfall on January 27th, Charles and Carol had stolen Robert Jensen's car and were driving toward Lincoln. They arrived at the home of C. Lauer Ward, a wealthy industrialist, and his wife Clara. The Wards lived in a large house in an affluent neighborhood. It should have been a fortress. Instead, it became a tomb. Charles and Carol entered the home and took the couple hostage. The maid, Lillian Fenkel, was also there. All 3 were killed. C. Lauer Ward was stabbed. Clara Ward was stabbed and shot. Lillian Fenkel's body was found with multiple stab wounds. The house was ransacked. Jewelry was taken. Cash was taken. Charles and Carol stayed in the Ward home overnight, sleeping in the beds, eating the food in the refrigerator, watching television as if nothing had happened. On January 29th, they fled west toward Wyoming in the Ward's Black Packard. Outside the town of Douglas, they encountered Merle Collison, a traveling salesman who had pulled over to sleep in his car. Charles shot him 9 times. As Charles attempted to steal Collison's car, a passing motorist stopped to help. Charles pointed his gun at the man, but the man fought back. In the struggle, Carol ran to a passing car and screamed for help. She would later claim this was the first time she'd been able to escape. Charles would later claim she'd been a willing participant all along. The question of Carol's role haunted every conversation about the case. Was she a 14-year-old victim, terrorized and controlled by a violent older boyfriend? Or was she a willing accomplice who helped plan and execute the murders? Police found no evidence of restraints. No evidence she'd been physically abused during those 8 days. But she was 14. She was with a man who had killed 11 people. And the truth of what happened between them may have died long before Charles Starkweather ever sat in that electric chair. By the time the killing stopped, 11 people were dead. A toddler, a teenager couple, an elderly farmer, a wealthy family and their maid, a traveling salesman, and the first victim, Robert Calvert, whose murder had started it all. 8 days, 11 lives, and a story that will be told and retold for decades to come. By January 28, 1958, Nebraska was in a state of terror. Schools across the state closed their doors. Parents kept their children home. Gun stores in Lincoln reported selling out of ammunition within hours. Armed civilians set up roadblocks on rural roads, stopping cars and checking identification. The National Guard was placed on standby, and still, Charles Starkweather and Carol and Fugate remained at large. Police had discovered the bodies of the Bartlett house on January 27th, after relatives grew suspicious of the handwritten sign and Charles's aggressive behavior. Within hours, authorities had connected the dots to August Meyer's murder. Then the bodies of Robert Jensen and Carol King were found. Then the Ward family. The pattern was clear. The killer was moving fast, and he wasn't stopping. Law enforcement agencies across Nebraska and Wyoming coordinated the largest manhunt in the region's history. Roadblocks were established at state lines. Police bulletins were issued to every department within a 5-state radius. Charles Starkweather's photograph appeared on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The FBI joined the investigation. And still, for nearly 2 full days, Charles and Carol managed to stay ahead of the dragnet. On the morning of January 29th, Deputy Sheriff William Romer was patrolling near Douglas, Wyoming, when he spotted a black Packard sedan parked on the side of Highway 20. It matched the description of a vehicle stolen from the Ward home. Romer called for backup and approached the car. As he drew closer, he saw a man leaning over another man who appeared to be sleeping in a car nearby. The man standing was Charles Starkweather. The man in the car was Merle Collison, and Collison had been shot 9 times. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Charles, realizing the situation was collapsing, jumped back into the stolen Packard and fled. Deputy Romer, now aware of what was happening, radioed for assistance and gave chase. Within minutes, multiple law enforcement vehicles were pursuing Charles Starkweather at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour across the Wyoming plains. Charles drove recklessly, swerving across lanes, running stop signs, pushing the Packard to its limits. Police fired at the vehicle. One bullet shattered the rear windshield. Another grazed Charles's left ear. Blood trickled down the side of Charles's face. He later admitted that he believed he'd been shot in the head and was bleeding to death. Panicked, he slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop. Police surrounded the vehicle with weapons drawn. Charles stepped out with his hands up. The manhunt was over. His first words to police were about his ear. He wanted to know if he was going to die. He asked for a mirror. He seemed more concerned about his appearance than about the 11 people he'd killed. When officers handcuffed him and placed him in the back of a patrol car, Charles Starkweather, the teenage rebel who had terrorized an entire state, looked small and ordinary. Just a bow-legged kid with red hair and a bleeding ear. Just another nobody who'd wanted to be remembered. Charles Starkweather's trial began on May 5, 1958, less than 4 months after murders. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, detailed confessions, eyewitness testimony, physical evidence linking Charles to every crime scene. The defense argued temporary insanity. They claimed his childhood trauma and mental deficiencies made him incapable of understanding his actions. Psychiatrists examined him. They found him legally sane. Charles testified in his own defense. His story shifted depending on the day. At first, he claimed Carol and was innocent, that he'd forced her to come with him, that she'd had no choice. Then he changed his story. He said she'd helped plan the murders. He said she'd encouraged him. He said she'd been a willing participant all along. The jury didn't believe either version. After 24 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The sentence: death by electrocution. Charles showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He sat in the courtroom, hands folded, staring straight ahead as if the whole proceeding had nothing to do with him. Carol in Fugate was tried separately in October 1958. She maintained throughout that she'd been Charles's hostage, that he'd threatened to kill her if she didn't cooperate, that she'd been terrified for her life. The jury deliberated for 13 hours. They found her guilty as an accomplice to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. She would serve 17 years before being paroled in 1976, still maintaining her innocence. Charles's appeals were denied at every level. His execution date was set for June 25, 1959. The truth of what really happened during those 8 days would die with him. On June 24, 1959, Charles ordered his last meal: cold cuts, sliced bread, black coffee. Prison officials asked if he wanted anything else. He said no. Some sources suggest he was offered a more elaborate meal, but declined. He wanted to keep it simple. He wanted to go out the same way he'd lived. Ordinary, unremarkable, just another face in the crowd. That evening, Charles was visited by a chaplain. They spoke for an hour. What was said in that conversation remains private. Charles was asked if he wanted to make a final statement. He said he would wait until the end. At 12:01 a.m. on June 25, 1959, Charles Raymond Starkweather was escorted from his cell to the execution chamber. Family members of his victims watched from behind a glass partition. Journalists filled the witness gallery. Prison officials stood at attention. Charles walked with that same bow-legged gait that had defined him his entire life. He was strapped into the electric chair. Leather restraints secured his arms, legs, and chest. A metal cap was placed on his head. A wet sponge was positioned beneath it to conduct the electricity. A cloth mask covered his face. The warden read the execution order. Charles was given the opportunity to speak. His final words, according to official records, were brief. Some sources report he said nothing. Others claim he apologized to the families of his victims. One account suggests he said, "I hope this helps." The exact words remain disputed, lost to time in conflicting witness accounts. At 12:04 a.m., the switch was thrown. Charles Starkweather's body convulsed as 2,200 volts of electricity surged through him. The execution lasted less than 3 minutes. A doctor examined him and pronounced him dead at 12:07 a.m. He was 20 years old. His body was released to his family. He was buried in Wyoming Cemetery in Lincoln, Nebraska, not far from some of the victims he'd killed. The families of those victims had finally received the justice they'd waited 17 months to see. But justice, for many of them, felt like an empty word. Their loved ones were still gone. The toddler would never grow up. The teenagers would never graduate. The elderly farmer would never see another harvest. And nothing, not even the death of Charles Starkweather, could bring them back.